Hey everybody, I think that I'm finally live with all of the sort of technical difficulties. This is the first time doing a YouTube live thing. But anyways, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and the purpose of this video is to sort of pick up where we left off with, all right, here we go. I had a bunch of people sharing a bunch of links. How to stream this video. Okay, all right, great. So last week or 2 weeks ago, Dan Mall and myself, we hopped on a call and talked about how we design and develop together, and we started creating a new version of the Pattern Lab website, which the current version looks like this right here. But if you're curious about sort of where to start with this, I definitely recommend sort of taking a look at our video that we recorded together that just sort of talks about us going back and forth with one another as designer and developer. And we sort of talk about our workflow and how we sort of quickly get things into the browser. And so one of the main things I want to sort of emphasize here is that Dan and I, we work very closely together, as well as with, Josh Clark and my brother Ian and other sort of team members. We work in a very close cross-disciplinary manner. But that's not to say that we're always on a Google Hangout or a Zoom call or whatever, just always on and collaborating with each other in real time. So there is a bit of head down time required in order to sort of make progress as a designer and as a developer. And you sort of come together and sort of go away and come back together and go away. But I think the one point that Dan and I made in the last video was that the time to sort of go away is not, hey, I'm going to go do days worth of work by myself and then sort of come down and eventually catch up with you on it. It's really, we want to quickly make progress on our ends, sort of stand up what we need to stand up, and then sort of quickly sort of reconvene and then sort of make progress together. And this helps make sure that designers and developers are on the same page, that we're able to sort of sort of have everything sort of moving in the right direction, and to make sure that, again, that designers and developers are building sort of the same thing. So this is where I left off in the last video, which doesn't look like much. And so this is sort of what I want to address today, is I want to sort of make a little bit more progress on this page layout. And Dan and I, we had sort of talked through a bunch of we talked through a bunch of sort of strategies and just ideas and design ideas. And let me see if I can sort of bounce over to Photoshop real quick. So these were the artifacts that Dan created during our last session, which was sort of a hint of what the sort of left-hand navigation might look like, and also a hint of what sort of this like a top-level heading and a sort of a monospaced sort of call to action or sort of accent font, what that might look like. And then he also sort of put together this sort of general blob of a, starting to put some shape to the overall layout. And so this is sort of, I think, the thing that I want to tackle today. By the way, this is just a lo-fi screenshot of from our video, because Dan didn't sort of share that artifact with me, but that's fine. Again, these are all just ideas, and the idea is to sort of take this and turn it into something real inside of the browser. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just spend some time coding this page up, getting this. I think I'm going to sort of kill the top header and just sort of treat everything as this sort of vertical header, sort of this sort of 2-column layout kind of thing you'll see in a lot of different sort of documentation sites. So I'm probably going to talk through things as I sort of encounter them. I'm probably going to sort of stop and chat about things, but I'm also going to uh, uh, maybe just put my head down and do some stuff. So there might be some stretches that that I'm not saying much, but we'll see. We'll see. I've never sort of done a live thing like this before, so this will be a learning experience for us all. So one thing that I talked about in the last video was sort of giving a bit of an overview of Pattern Lab, which is the tool we're using to sort of create this new design. And one thing I want to point out is that in the last video, I was using a version of Pattern Lab, my sort of gulp setup, gulp workflow setup that was a bit old and crusty. And so you're actually sort of seeing sort of not a true representation of sort of how the workflow tends to look, in that I would make an update to our background color, say turn the color green, and in the last video it would have to sort of rebuild the entire sort of all of the patterns and stuff like that. And that was a mistake on my part. I just sort of quickly and hastily sort of installed an old version and went from there. But so now, as you can see, if I sort of make a color change or a style change, you can see it pretty quickly updates in the browser. So hopefully that makes things a little easier here. Okay, so first order of business is I want to sort of turn this header on its side, and I'm going to figure out how to do that. So I have a header. Let's actually open up. I'm going to go into my patterns and go into my template, and I think that I'm on a detail page. So you can see I have a header. I have this sort of tree navigation, and inside of this grid layout which has sort of a sidebar and a main column and stuff like that. And so what I actually want to do is I want to sort of I want to move my header into my tree navigation, I'm sorry, into my sidebar, because I want that to display across the top. So you can see that rebuilt, and now my logo and my primary navigation is now inside of inside of our sidebar. So that's good news. So that's exactly what I want to sort of accomplish with this. I'm going to be sort of futzing around here and just sort of figuring out where we landed with things, because I did think I sort of hacked a couple things just for sort of demonstration purposes. So for instance, I have this sort of sidebar background color gray 88 and our color set to white. And so I actually don't want that. With layout styles, I want those things to be those styles to pertain only to the layout. So things like positioning and sort of grid counts and columns and rows and all of that stuff, rather than like background colors and stuff like that. So I'm actually going to wipe that out, so you can see that sort of changes that over there. So now what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to open up my header, and I actually want my header to be this background color gray and the color white and stuff like that. So we're going to do a number of things here. I actually think I might end up killing this tree navigation simply because this is technically the header of the entire site, is basically going to be this sort of sidebar nav sort of thing, right? So I'm actually just going to sort of move the entire thing into the header. So I'm going to open up my header. You can see this. I have this sort of primary nav here, and so I guess I could sort of change this to tree nav. And then I'm also going to open my detail template back up, and I'm going to remove that. So I've now sort of added my tree nav directly into my header. So the only object now sitting in my sidebar is the header. And you can see that I have this header sort of set to display flex. I don't want that necessarily, or I actually might want that, but I want to sort of set the direction to column. And what that's going to do is to sort of set these things on top of each other rather than sort of side by side. So, okay, so this is starting to look better. One of the other things that I want to do is set a min height of 100 VH. That's my dog Ziggy. Shh. Okay, he's being a good guard dog. All right, so I wanted to set that to minimum height of VH in order to sort of always occupy the sort of full sort of okay. Okay, let the dog out. He is a good guard dog. Whenever he hears the UPS man squeaking his brakes down our street, he goes into protection mode. So, okay, all right, I'm back with you. So, anyway, so I want to have a header that is always sort of set to 100% of the viewport height, and you can see that it's set to 100% of the viewport height, but it obviously sort of has unintended consequences, which is, it sort of scrolls sort of past, scrolls past if the contents of the page is taller than the viewport height, it's going to not sort of continue down. So here's where I have a decision to make, which is basically, do I want to sort of fix our sort of header so that the logo and the navigation is always the case, or is always sort of present, and this scrolls at a different thing while this remains locked in place? Or do I want to have the entire thing sort of scroll with me? And I'm not sure. Let's see what other things do. If I go to this thing and sort of come here. Okay, so this is locked. These are sort of independently scrolling things. Let's just see what other people are doing, just as a way to sort of, okay, so this is locked into place. They sort of have like a locked header. What's another project? You got sort of like jQuery or something like that. This one seems like maybe a bit of a different. Okay, so this one does scroll with Chris Coyer actually just released a good article that was like, what was it? CSS, sticky navigation. Yeah, this is the thing. This is pretty cool. He just created this thing, which is this whole sort of like local navigation, and sort of updates the active states based on like what section you're on. I think that's pretty cool. So I might want to keep that in mind, right? So again, in my work with Dan, we'll just sort of like throw these things by each other. And I think that, Dan's a firm advocate of sort of like stealing other people's work in the the most sort of thoughtful way of using that word, is sort of just being like, cool, I could create a comp for these 3 different behaviors, or I could build all of these things out, or I could just go to other sites and go, oh, okay, they're doing this, this one's doing this. And like, these all are points of conversations to have with your team. It's sort of a great way of sort of just getting on the same page and sort of like, running ideas by one another, rather than sort of, again, in a traditional sort of waterfall process. The designer is the one sort of like coming up with a lot of these sort of aesthetic solutions, but they don't necessarily take into account these sort of behavioral things. So it's like, okay, like what happens? Like, does this scroll? Does this lock into place? Is that, this is important stuff. This affects the behavior and the look and the feel of the entire experience, but isn't something that you could really sort of handle in a static design environment. So this is all the more reason we want to sort of get into the browser. So for right now, I'm just going to sort of like leave that be. I'm going to sort of revisit that and maybe sort of come back to that later. But one of the things I do want to do is sort of get a better representation of what Dan had come up with over here. So I sort of have the starts of this. So I have my sort of sidebar thing with this sort of dark gray thing, and that contains the guts of the header. But now I'm going to sort of focus my attention more on the sort of main panel because I really like what Dan had done, and I would like to maybe recreate that. So let's crack open our detail template once again, and you can see I have sort of a few components that I'm including in this page. I'm including this thing called a page header, where if I open that up, page header, you'll see that the page header consists of an H1 tag that is the title of the page. And then there's also an optional page description. And you can see that this is mustache code right here. So I have page description. So if I set that to false, or if I don't define that, the page description won't show up. So just as an example, I could come into my pages and come into my docs detail. What is it? Docs detail install, I guess. Or wait. Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, so I need to create docs detail install .json. So this is where things get really exciting, because this is where I'm able to start playing around with this stuff. I'm able to sort of say title docs detail page. So this is at the page level. How Pattern Lab works is you basically sort of take global data and you replace it at the page level with sort of page specific content. So I think I'm doing this wrong. Let me sort of go back to my page header. So I need to do page dot title. So let's try this out. So if I go page, sort of nested inside here, it's going to be title. Go through and rebuild. Yeah, there we go. Okay, docs detail page. And then I can set something like description. So now the page description, I could set that to false. And what should happen is that this thing that's set to this is the page description is now gone. So I might want that page description on some pages or other stuff. So I'm just going to sort of like click into some of the sort of documentation pages on the live site. I don't really have like a description here. It just sort of gets right into the guts. So I'll sort of switch that to false for right now. And in fact, let me actually do that globally so that I'm not having to sort of recreate that again and again. So if I go to data, I will set description to false, or just sort of simply not define it. And so now that option is available to me, and I might want that on certain pages, but I'm not actually going to sort of need it for most pages. So I'll sort of set the default to false, and then I can switch it on for pages that I might want that description on. So this is really cool, because what this allows us to do is, and this is why I think it's so important to sort of build in an environment, or what we tend to call like a workshop environment, like Pattern Lab or like Storybook or Vue DS or there's a number of them out there, but these sort of like standalone environments that you're able to sort of design with dynamic data. So I'm able to sort of very quickly go, okay, well, like what happens if, this says docs detail page, but let's see what happens if it's this crazy long uh, uh, page title. And so we could rebuild there and actually sort of see what that looks like. And then again, have a thoughtful conversation with the rest of the team to basically say, oh, okay, our headlines, the max character length seems to be about this. So we need to make sure that we're able to accommodate these different sort of user scenarios and product scenarios. So I'm going to sort of switch this back for now, back to docs detail page, and maybe I'll sort of come back over here. Dan has this nice sort of reorganizing patterns sort of thing on here. So, okay, I'm going to do a few things. One, you could see that there is a lot of sort of white space above here. And right now I am certainly not operating with a lot of sort of white space above me. And so I could do this a number of ways as well. Where is this white space coming from? Like, what should be controlling that? Is this our sort of like layout main container? Is this should it be a margin top on our page header? Should it be the main column? Like, I'm not sure yet. So let's see here. So I could do it. I could add all of this on grid main. So I could say something like padding top 8 rems or something like that. Okay, that pushes that down. Do I want to do that? Maybe, but what about, let's say, like the home page, we wanted to do sort of something different, where we wanted sort of a big hero unit to sort of be fixed to the top of the page. I might not want that padding there. I could do the page header. That's sort of a safe bet on most of these pages, that basically the first thing that pops up is going to be this H1 tag. So I could go into page header and then sort of say, okay, I want my page header to have a padding top of 8 rems. And normally I'd say I don't do this, just because I tend to try to follow Harry Roberts' advice, which is basically sort of stick a direction and sort of keep all of your padding and all of your sort of margin. I guess this could be margin as well. Keep all of that stuff moving in one direction for the most part. So you can see that my header title and my header description and stuff are all using margin bottom to sort of push stuff away from it across the bottom, right? So I'm not saying, page header description, margin top. I'm sort of using margin bottom pretty consistently across the board. So it might be a little weird for me to do margin top here, just because, again, we want those sort of values to be consistent across our code base. And that sort of prevents a lot of surprises, which ends up happening whenever you sort of have a margin top and a margin bottom sort of colliding with one another. So, all right, I'm still haven't solved this problem yet. So let's just sort of open my markup. What options do I have to work with? You can see right now I don't have. So I have my main container sort of wrapping everything, and this is actually not what I want anymore. Since I moved my header into this sort of like sidebar column, I actually want my main column to sort of be inside here. So I'm going to come in here, and then while I'm here, I'm also going to move the footer inside of my sort of my layout grid main column, because I don't want that to be sort of floating around where it currently is. I want that to appear inside of my grid now. So okay, so what I'm doing now is so just sort of zooming out for a second. I have a grid sort of wrapping my entire page, right? So the outermost element of this entire thing is my grid. And then I have my header organism included inside of my sidebar. And then I have the main guts of the page as well as my footer component included in the sort of main content area for my grid. One other little trick that I like doing is sort of always closing block level HTML tags with a closing thing like this. So this just sort of helps keep the code nice and readable, so you know what's being closed out, so you don't just have a bunch of like sort of floating sort of divs flying around. And I'll say that another thing you'll see with my code is I tend to add a lot of white space in here. And I know some developers will just absolutely freak out seeing something like this. But, this is, I've found it to be more legible for my work. So I tend to do a lot of that. And again, different strokes for different folks. But I do think that it's worth pointing out where, as a development team, if you're tasked with writing in a team environment, you all need to sort of land on these conventions yourselves and to stick to them, right? So if you're going to do a bunch of white space around stuff, then great. Do that and commit to it and have everyone follow suit. You don't want to open up one file and it be a certain way, and open other files and it be another way. So for this exact reason, I created a questionnaire called the Front End Guidelines Questionnaire, which sort of tackles stuff like this, which is basically like, all right, how are we as a team going to write front end code together, right? Are we going to sort of write HTML with this stuff? Like, what principles are we following? What tools and templating engines and things like that are we using? From a CSS perspective, what sort of syntax are we using? What methodology are we using? What tools are we using? And so on and so forth. And then lastly, sort of same thing with JavaScript. So all of this is, with the intention of, okay, if you're writing code as a team, you want to sort of arrive at a place where everybody, right from day one, is sort of following the same conventions, right, and sort of sticking to them. So okay, so I have this. Where am I now? I have this. I'm pushing down my page header this way. And I'm gonna take that out, just because, again, I don't like that I'm using margin top here, but I'm using margin bottom literally everywhere else, and I intend on continuing to use margin bottom. So what I might actually do is just apply this for right now to my main sort of block. And this might get me into trouble a little bit later, but we could sort of handle that when we get there. But for right now, that's going to be sort of how I tackle that sort of top padding. Now, you could sort of see Dan didn't sort of fill in any of this stuff over here. So as far as like the logo and in the navigation, and so I don't really know. I'm gonna have to have a conversation with him about sort of how best to sort of align this stuff, right? So right now, like the logo placeholder is flush right up against the top, and I would obviously want to bring that down a little bit, but I'm just gonna sort of like leave that stuff be. And instead, what I'm going to do is come into my sort of typography stuff now, and to try to normalize some of that stuff as well. So you can see my H1 styles are the thing that is sort of controlling that font size. So if I come into my base styles, you can see I'm using these sort of H1, H2, H3, H4 sort of styles. These are like hard-coded font sizes, and I don't think I want to do that. I think that this is an old sort of version of this sort of starter kit, and we've since sort of updated it to include things like this, where we sort of have, oh, okay, I have like a mix-in file that defines some of this stuff. Hang on one second. Okay, sorry about that. So I have a couple mix-ins that I'm using to sort of define and sort of clump some of these typographic properties together. So things like font size and line height tend to travel together. And so I want to sort of bring that stuff over. So I'm going to sort of paste that stuff in, and I'm going to paste stuff in as well. So come into headings. Okay. There we go. Okay. So now you can see, so I've like sort of like done away with, now the mix-in is controlling my sort of extra large heading style. So I'll go out on a limb and assume that the H1 tag is going to be my sort of extra large styles. So what I want to do is I want to get rid of that font weight normal, because I want to keep the default sort of bold thing here. But you could also see that Dan was playing around with like letter spacing and getting that sort of closer together. So I think I want to play with that as well. So I'm just going to sort of come in here and say letter spacing, -2 pixels, maybe 3 pixels, maybe 4 pixels might be too much. Say 3 pixels. We'll start there. And again, this is all stuff where like with Dan, I could go, okay, what do you think? Tell me when, right? Tell me when to stop. And just sort of like this kind of web inspector stuff is stuff that I personally think that designers can and should be able to play around with and say like, hey, like I see the working prototype. I sort of made these like nudges here, the nudges that I made, and that sort of helps save the developer time, and they can focus on making things, work, and sort of leave some of this stuff to the designers working directly with the browser. Some teams might be comfortable with that. Some teams might be uncomfortable with that. But I think that that's a handy tool to have in your toolkit. So, okay. So because I'm sort of defining this stuff, you can see I also have like a line height of 1.6. And what did I do? Oh, yeah, I think we started defining these. Yeah, here we go. So sort of like bringing in like line height into our variables as well. So again, this is all like, it's all just part of an evolution where it's just like, okay, like we're sort of wiping these things out. We're adding new things. We're getting stuff in there. Line height. Oh, it's yelling at me because my body tag is using the line height sort of thing. And I think that what I want to do, maybe change that to line height large, let's say. So my default, yep. Okay, so my default body line height is now set to line height large, which if I go back to my variables file, is set to 1.6, right? So that's sort of like a little bit more than 1.5 times the size of the thing. Okay, all right. So getting closer. This is feeling a little bit better. One of the other things I want to do, just sort of like looking at Dan's little sketch, and I totally agree with this, is I want to sort of get this content a little bit further away from the sidebar here. So the way I'm going to do that is go into my layout file, and I remember we sort of set up a grid gap of 2 rems. And let me just change that to 6 rems for now and see what that does. And that sort of pushes that out a little bit, right? So that's starting to feel a little bit better, right? That's feeling comfortable. That's feeling cozy. Looks like Dan's line length is a little bit longer than mine as well. And I think that in the last video, we talked about this sort of line length container as sort of like this thing that allows us to sort of cap passages of text to a comfortable reading length. So you could see that by default, I had it set to 36 rems, which I could come back into my variables file and go to line length. Yep. So here 36. So I could change that to say 40, and then that will sort of update the line length so that those paragraphs can be a little bit longer. And let me just come back into Photoshop and like see how that's feeling. Sure, that feels okay for the most part. Okay, it's starting to come together. Let's see what to handle next. You know what? This actually looks like this text can be opened up quite a bit more. So I might come back in here and change my body. Instead of line height large, I might change it to line height extra large. Okay, now that feels even closer, right? And I sort of want to stress too that it's like, again, I'm not following this comp blindly. What I'm doing is I'm sort of like getting it into the basic shape of what Dan has sort of put together, right? The ideas that he's sort of put together. And I'm sort of bringing these to life in the browser. But this isn't like me just sort of like blindly following his orders, but rather getting it into a good position so that we can sort of have another conversation about this stuff. So it's like, okay, you know, and hopefully we will do another video where we're able to, you know, sort of talk about this stuff in detail again. But what I'm doing right now is trying to sort of get to a good place where we can have a constructive conversation where it's like, okay, I sort of put this stuff in place. Now what? Or okay, I put this stuff in place and I'm running into these issues, and like, let's talk about that stuff. So that's the spirit of this stuff. All right. Did I not? Where did my heading style? Let's see here. Mix-ins. I never did bring in that. I wanted to do that letter spacing -3. Maybe something didn't look right there. Okay, that's gonna suck that in. Okay. Here's a fun one. So now if you sort of look at this, it might be hard to see in the video. But one of the things that Dan was talking about last time is this is like a light gray background. And what I want to do, or what Dan was saying could be really cool, is to sort of have this sort of like white box around our actual title. In order to sort of create this sort of like knockout effect, or this sort of like highlight effect. Now, there's a number of different ways we can do this. The one way, of course, to do this is go like background white. But you could sort of see where this falls down, right? Like this is not a good approach, simply because it sort of goes the full bleed, right? Like what we would want to do, of course, I could just sort of change this to, you know, display inline or something like that. And that sort of gets us a little bit closer. But at the same time, if I sort of come back to Dan's thing, this R, right, this sort of left side of the R, I'm sure that there's a proper typographic term for it, is not aligned with the body copy, right? And so what we want is this sort of like extra padding around this. And so there is a number of ways of doing this. And I want to say, you know, what, I don't know what to search. Heading, sort of wrap, background color, something like that. Multi-line padded text, maybe. Is this it? Yeah. Hey, this looks like what we want, right? I think. So it looks like there's a number of different ways we could do this. We could do this with box shadows. We could do this with a little bit of JavaScript box and decoration break model. So this is interesting just because this is 2013. I feel like I saw a recent article about this, but I could be wrong about this. This is where Googling can be your friend or not be your friend. This is something else. But welcome to the world of trying to get things done, right? And it's like anybody that likes to pretend that they have all of these ideas fully baked in their head and they know exactly how to accomplish this stuff is fooling you, right? We're all on sites like CSS Tricks and Smashing Mag and a list apart and all of these sites all the time. So okay, box shadow. Let's give this a try. Box shadow. So okay, so they're showing display inline is something that we want to do. So okay, so let's start here. I'm gonna come in. Oh, it's also worth pointing out. It's like this comes up quite a bit, where it's like, oh, okay, in my mixins thing, it's like, oh, here's my typography heading XL. Some teams will like try to write all of their styles here inside of this block, but what that ends up doing is sort of overloading this mixin with a bunch of stuff that isn't specific to typography. So what we're really doing is we're just trying to, the whole reason why I tend to be really light on my mixins in my development, just because like they can be abused, I think, very, very easily. But at the same time, for things like typography, it actually sort of makes sense for things like font size, line height, and letter spacing to travel together, right? And things like font weight. And that's like sort of the extent of it. So you could see that we're including that typography heading XL in our H1s. So now it's like, oh, okay, so do I write my H1, do I write this sort of background stuff here at my sort of base level, or do I do this at the component level? And I'm not going to do this at the base level. I don't think that that's the right move. Instead, what I want to do is I want to sort of come into my actual sort of page header title, and this feels like the right place to write these styles that are going to sort of result in this sort of like white background text. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, you know, background white, just to sort of show you. But I'm also going to set this maybe to inline block. Will that work? Maybe. Okay. So all right. So this is starting to come together. And okay, what else? What could I do now? All right. So now I want to do this whole sort of background orange, and then I want to do, let's just try adding in this box shadow here. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so do you see what just happened there? So using this sort of multiple box shadow, I can add sort of a box shadow before the text and after the text. Okay, so that's cool. I'm a little curious, though, how is this going to work if I have a really long headline? Let's see how this approach works. Okay, so maybe that was because I did inline block. I also might want to like cap right now. I'll do like 40 ems. I don't think that I'm including that. Oh, wow. Oh, funky. Oh, that's a pretty cool effect. I was not expecting that, actually. All right, so let me just quickly change this stuff to color in my actual sort of variables. 10 pixels. Holy cow. I was not expecting that. That's pretty neat. By neat, I mean this might be a desired effect. This also might be horrible. This might so this is something this sounds like exactly something I would want to sort of talk to Dan about. And so like let's see if I could play around with this a little bit. So we're looking at is it line height that's controlling this sort of, yeah, okay. We could sort of see, okay, so if I cinch that up to like 1.2, now this has this effect on it. The other thing, I might want to sort of kick out this thing. Let's say 20 pixels instead. Just feel like a little bit more for our H1 might be a good idea. But holy smokes, yeah, I was not anticipating that. That's really cool. So I'm going to change this back to 1.2. So again, like this is something where it's like, okay, if Dan were here with me, I'd be like, all right, what do we do about this? Is this acceptable? Is this too much? Is this, like what is the right sort of call, right? Do we want like a little bit of spacing in between? Like that sort of looks cool. I buy that. That looks neat. So in that case, I might want to sort of change that and go back to my mix-ins or whatever. And you can see I have this sort of line height 1.6. Oh yeah, that was still a hard-coded value. I still need to sort of change this. Let me just change this to line height medium 2. Dan and I were talking about this. So we're sort of, I feel like I could be doing a better job at sort of like making this make sense, to sort of have stuff travel together a little bit more. And I'm not going to say that I feel especially good about this thing. Let me go back to my variables here. So that was like okay, 1.2. 1.2 gives me this. Okay, sure. I'll sort of stop. I'll stop there for now, just because I feel like that's good. All right, I'm gonna sort of kick back this to like a sensible line length here. Cool. All right. One thing I do want to do, you could see that the sort of like, this is another point of conversation that I'd probably want to have with Dan. So it's like, you could see that inside of my line length container, I've sort of like, I've wrapped our text passage. If I go to detail, yeah. So I have this line length container, and inside here is the actual guts of the page, right? So this is the actual sort of like body content of the page, but the page header is sort of outside of that line length container. And I think my gut is saying I probably want to move that inside of the line length container to also sort of wrap where the text passage wraps as well. So what that allows me to do is sort of take off this max width that I sort of added on there really quickly. So, okay. Okay. All right. So this is feeling good. I feel pretty good about this right now. Maybe one of the other things I want to do is I want to add some space in between this page header and the actual sort of whatever comes below it. So I'm going to say, spacing large or something like this. This is another thing that I feel like I'm still getting my feet wet on sort of being better about sort of like spacing and stuff. But like we tend to do like sort of spacing. So this should probably be spacing here, where it's like margin bottom spacing. And so you're like sort of defining constants for like how far things are spaced from one another. But anyways, so all right, I feel pretty good about this. I'm gonna just sort of go back to Dan's little idea here and sort of look at what I have in the browser, and I'm like, you know what? That feels like a great place to sort of to sort of hang this up. One thing I do like, he sort of has like a bit of a, we'll say like a softer gray. This like F8, F8, F8. What am I using for my? Do I have F8, 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 or is it F9, F9, F9? Body. I'm using gray, 7% gray. Oops. What just happened? Using 7% gray when I think I want to use like a 2% gray. That it? Am I adding too much gray in this? Maybe that's too soft. There's like not enough contrast. I don't know. These are all sort of things I could talk about with Dan. So, but in any case, I now sort of have something I feel pretty good about. This is a page layout. I have some sort of like basic default sort of typography settings in there. I have like my sort of nav sort of set up, and maybe I'll switch gears there next, or maybe I'll do something like, sometimes I get, this is we'll say like a little, sometimes I'll focus on guilty pleasure tasks, which are things that are like of no consequence. Like right now, I really don't have to be messing with the footer, but it's bothering me. so sometimes, even though there's like far more pressing sort of things I should focus my attentions on, what I'm going to do is just really quickly just sort of come into the footer, and I'm going to wipe out this background. I don't think that makes sense. This padding right now, I don't think that I need that. Or maybe if I do have that, I'll sort of do like spacing large and 0. So you can see it's like sort of misaligned with the other stuff. So, all right, so that's that. So inside of my footer nav, though, I have these sort of like stacked blocks, and let's see. Do I have footer nav? So footer nav is its own component. Footer nav. Doesn't look like I have a component for it in my SAS, so I'm going to create it. Footer nav. Again, I should be working on far more important issues. Big comment, I use text expander to do stuff like this, which is something I've found to be really helpful. So I have like these nice little sort of content comment blocks and stuff. The nav inside the footer, and sort of say C footer nav. And what I'm going to do is say, is this the list? Yep, it's the list. I'm going to say display flex, save that out. And then I need to include this inside of my style sheet. So I'm just going to sort of come down here, and I'm going to say footer and footer nav. I know that there are ways that I could sort of like automate all of that stuff. Okay, so you can now see in my footer, it looks like this. But this is also an example where it's like, oh, okay, like I'm sort of doing this at the very bottom of the page. It actually could be helpful to sort of just zoom right in on that component. So here's this component in isolation. That's I think one of like the core things that Pattern Lab does really well is just gives you the ability to sort of like zoom in on a specific component as you design it, and sort of do your work there. Margin right spacing. I don't know. Just sort of like bump these out, right? Maybe we'll do spacing large. And again, this is of no consequence right now, but what I could do is go back to this page, and now, okay, that feels like a footer sort of thing. So, and maybe I want to sort of change this, like, yeah, font size, small, just to sort of shrink it, just to really emphasize the fact that this is something else entirely. But anyway, so those are like little, we'll say, productive procrastination tasks where it's like, yeah, like who gives a crap about the footer when you haven't designed the rest of the page? But sometimes it's like, I don't know. Sometimes those are little therapeutic tasks that sort of helps keep your sanity across the board. So, okay, feel pretty good about this page structure. This feels good. If I come into like the current design, I could sort of see how all of this sort of content plays out. So documenting patterns, things like that. I have all of these different things, right? Modifying the pattern header and footer, things along those lines. And you can see that most of the content is already there. And we're going to do a bit of an overhaul or a refresh of our documentation, but for the most part, it's going to stay largely the same. So I'm not too worried about that stuff. But one thing I can do is sort of quickly just sort of show by way of for point of conversation, show what it looks like with a short headline and a long headline, for instance. So one of the cool things that you could do with Pattern Lab is create something called a pseudo pattern. And what a pseudo pattern is it is a thing, short headline. It's a thing that allows me to take our data that we've sort of defined elsewhere and sort of override or append or remove other pieces of data. So what this will do is in Pattern Lab's navigation, it's now built two patterns for me. So it's created the docs detail install that I've done, that I showed earlier. But then I can also show, okay, here's a variation of that same pattern with just different data sort of poured into it. So I updated the page title to short headline instead of this docs detail page lorem ipsum sort of thing. And what's cool about this is that now, once again, all in the pursuit of thoughtful conversations with my team, I'm able to say like, okay, here's what it looks like with these parameters. Here's what it looks like with these parameters instead, right? Here's what it looks like with these properties, and so on and so forth. So you can do this with anything. And so we'll often do this with things like alerts and things like that. Like inside of our pattern library, you want to show like, here's what a info alert looks like versus a warning alert versus an error alert versus a success alert. And you can sort of just quickly sort of create these pseudo patterns and then just sort of pass in different parameters. So in the case of a sort of like an alert, you would have something like alert or I guess it'd be like style modifier, and you would be like see alert -- warning, right? And that would be like the only thing that the pseudo pattern contains, but then Pattern Lab will sort of generate a pattern that has that style modifier attached to it. And that's why, and what's great about that is that sort of keeps your markup dry, right? So that you have like sort of like one source of truth for your actual sort of pattern markup, but then you're able to sort of spit out all of these different variations with all these different props and stuff attached to them. It's sort of a parallel for those, in the React universe, that, tools like Storybook, right? That's like a new story is like a new instance of a pattern with different props passed into it. Okay. So I now have a couple instances of my documentation sort of thing. I think the next thing, what do I want to do next? I think I might want to sort of clean this guy up. I said that I would come back to this and sort of get a better sense of what my header looks like. And so that's what I'm going to do. So I'm quickly going to sort of come in here and just take a look at what's currently on the live site. So you can see what I'm doing now. I have this sort of like spinning atom logo. That is a background SVG. and then I have plain text for the actual words pattern lab. So, you could do this a number of ways. You can make the whole thing an SVG as like a little sort of like logo lockup. I think that I was just sort of doing it to sort of match the rest of the navigation. So it's like not really like a logo per se. So I'm not sure what I want to do about that now, but maybe, yeah, maybe. What do I want to do? Let's see here. Uh, Open in a new tab. All right. At the very least, I'm going to sort of rip out that image and put in my icon atom image into this page. So this could end up being cool too. Let's just like give this a set. So you could see, so by default, Pattern Lab puts all of its sort of like global data, its default data, inside of this sort of data folder. And so you could have your sort of defaults for things like, here's my button sort of props, my default props for my buttons, right? So I want my button text to say button. So if I go to buttons and view it, it says button, right? So if I change that to something else, if I say like, this is a test, and it will sort of like rebuild that pattern and sort of do that stuff. Now it says this is a test, right? So this is like our sort of like global default data. And then again, you can override that at the sort of page level or at like the component level by creating an accompanying JSON file that basically says like button text equals something else. So what I'm going to do here is, you can see I have a logo image path that is pointing to this sort of logo ping, which is this sort of gross thing here. So I could change that to anything I want. And so right now, let's just, for fun, I'm going to change this to icon atom. Ooh, okay. Just right there, that sort of changes things a bit, right? So I hadn't really considered maybe doing maybe more of like a vertical logo treatment instead of sort of the current horizontal treatment. But sort of looking at the way that this is coming out, that's maybe not a bad idea. So let me actually play with that a little bit. So I'm going to open up my logo. So all my logo is right now. Oh, wait. Do I have multiple logos? Let's see here. Logo. Yeah. Okay. So you can see I'm including my logo image, but then I'm including it's a logo, it's an H3 tag, it's an image that's pointing rel equals home, going back to the home page. I'm including my logo image asset. And a lot of that is just so that I can sort of say like, oh, what images are on this site? And I'm able to sort of say, oh, here's my like logo sort of image type. And this comes especially in handy whenever you have like larger projects and you have like a bunch of different image types. Like here's our hero image, and here's our card image, and here's our avatar image, and here's our logo image, and things like that. And what that helps you do is, especially like on the back end, sort of have a better understanding of like, here's all of the aspect ratios and dimensions and stuff that like the CMS is going to have to spit out. So I find it helpful to sort of like define that stuff. Okay, so coming in here, I sort of want to have a play with this. So I want to sort of say like, okay, I'm including my logo atom, but then I might also do something like span class C logo text, sure. And it's going to say pattern lab. And I guess I could be a little more thoughtful about this. And inside of my data, I could say data. So right out of the gate, I have like sort of like in my boilerplate sort of build, I have like sort of title. So sometimes I'll have like company name, right? So I could say, okay, company name is Pattern Lab. and the URL is HTTPS. We just switched over to that, patternlab.io. So now I can actually reference this stuff. So now I can sort of come back into my logo and actually say, instead of saying hard coding in Pattern Lab, I could say company name, which is pretty cool. It's not a company, of course, but it's like the sort of like global name of the thing, right? So what this allows me to do is, like, let's just say Pattern Lab wanted to change its name and rebrand to Pattern Wizard or something like that. All I have to do is sort of make that change in one place, and anywhere it's included will sort of magically update. So that's pretty cool. I will change it not back from Pattern Wizard. So, okay, so I now have this sort of stacked Pattern Lab logo. I'm going to sort of come back and see this in context here. I'm going to open my logo stuff and get to work. So let's see. I can do something along the lines of display flex direction column. I want to include a logo text block that basically, and I'm just going to say text transform lowercase. The Pattern Labs logo has always been. Sorry, you're hearing my bulldog sneeze or snore in the background. If you're wondering what that is. Okay, flex direction column, and then I always forget which one center aligns things. Oh, justify content. Maybe, hopefully. Maybe? Really? What am I doing wrong? Oh, it would be on the logo link that I would add that to. Okay, so let's change that. Flex. While I'm here, I'm going to say margin bottom, spacing large. Sort of push the logo away from things. Align items, center. Hopefully this should sort of center. Hey, that feels better. Okay, now let's get rid of our cartoonishly large atom and say, I don't know, max width 6 rems. Okay, that's starting to feel good. I might want to add some padding around the entire header. So I'll do padding. I guess I'll do spacing or something like that. Okay. All right. All right. This is starting to feel like something, maybe. Right? I buy it. So again, like, this is, I'm not totally bought on it. Let's actually do a little bit more work. Margin bottom of, this is sort of weird. I'm sort of like mixing. It's like this whole thing should probably be an SVG file or something like that. I just sort of, I'm not doing that, and I probably should. But anyways, this is starting to feel better. This is starting to feel good. All right. I'll buy that as a logo for now. Maybe I'll adjust this sort of text. Color. This is where things get sort of interesting too. So it's like I found myself gravitating, so I could do like color white or something, and then we'll sort of like beef that up. Okay, that feels, that feels sort of right, given the thickness of this sort of atom sort of thing and all of that. But then I could do some sort of funky stuff, maybe with like sort of like hover states and sort of like updating like the color of everything and so on and so forth. But for now, let's call that a day. So now let's come back into our tree nav sort of styles. And I'm going to sort of go back to the thing that Dan created just as a reference. And I feel like this is this is good, but I also sort of feel like maybe that's like a little too much spacing in between these things. So let's first and foremost work with a more realistic sort of depiction of what the navigation is going to be. So you can see my tree nav items is all sort of set to dock detail, and obviously that's not the only thing that we're going to have. So what I'm going to do instead is actually come to Pattern Labs website and actually sort of recreate this stuff. So I'm going to sort of call my documentation. Let's see here. Doc detail. I'll wipe all of that stuff out. And now I'm going to say download. I'm going to say documentation. I'm going to say resources. I'm going to say demos because I think we're going to do things like sort of plural there. And then I'm going to say on GitHub. Now, this obviously isn't the only navigation that's here. This is going to be like the sort of like top level nav. And we'll get into sort of building the sort of other navigation down the line. So okay, so you can start to see this take shape. You can see I have like a little sort of active state on resources, which is why you're seeing that thing lit up. So let's open up our tree nav. You can see I have like 2 rems of margin bottom on this stuff. Maybe it's not bad. I don't know. Maybe it's not. Maybe that's the right amount of space. I'm not sure yet. But let me just like, for curiosity's sake, let's like sort of cinch it up a little bit. Change it to 1. Is that too crazy? I don't know. What do other sites do? Let's find out. That sort of feels, they got a lot of stuff. They got a lot of stuff too. They're sort of doing some accordion style stuff, and we're going to want to do sort of something similar for our sort of tree navigation. So for documentation, what we're going to want it to do is have documentation, and then sort of nested inside there, we're going to have sort of getting started, working with patterns, working with data, advanced features, and so on. So I can create that. But for now, let me just get some basic stuff in here. All right. I have no idea how I'm doing. So if anyone, I'm probably just like rambling to myself throughout all of this, but hey, it's fun. Okay. So this gives me a better representation of like, you know, sort of, okay, I'm in the docs. The docs is active. I'm gonna need some sort of like sub nav sort of stuff in my tree. So okay, so I could do this, and I can create inside of here. I could say tree nav sub items. Well, I guess I'd say tree sub nav. Let's call it that. And then so inside here, so again, the way that mustache works is that, you know, this, if it's set to false, it won't display anything that's inside of here. And that's the sort of like cool thing about it. It's like, okay, this is like a conditional wrapper. So it's like only whenever we set tree sub nav to something other than false will it actually render. So if tree sub nav is set to true, we can sort of say, okay, render this C tree nav sub nav. And then inside here, I could say tree subnav items. And what this is going to do is loop through an array of subnav items, right? So however many sort of subnav items I want to render a list item and an a tag inside of here. Okay, and list will be tree nav underscore underscore subnav item, and then subnav link. This is sort of a fun little exercise in BEM syntax right here, by the way. So one thing that I think a lot of people do is sort of get a little hung up on BEM whenever you're talking about things like why is that not working? When you're talking about sort of a component, people will tend to sort of start doing things like subnav. It's like, oh, double underscore subnav, and then it's like, oh, okay, double score underscore underscore item, right? So it's like now you start to get into this sort of weird stuff. And what we tend to do is just sort of like flatten this out a little bit. So it's like subnav item is its own thing. Subnav link is its own thing. Sometimes you don't even necessarily need that stuff. You could just like sort of call it all like sort of tree nav item for all sort of tree nav things if you want it to be styled the same. Sometimes you want it styled differently, and so all that's to say, this thing is it can get a little sort of thorny if you're not careful. So okay, so let's just sort of recap. There we go. Once again, I like adding these little sort of ending comments on here. And again, I just sort of use text expander to sort of like build those little sort of containers. And then this just sort of helps. This just helps sort of better understand like where you're at and which things are being closed out and so on. Because otherwise, again, it can get pretty unwieldy. Okay. All right. So I just sort of rendered this whole sort of tree subnav thing. And if tree subnav is set to something other than false, it will spit out this unordered list called tree subnav. And then it will sort of loop through these tree subnav items. And then I can sort of define that stuff here, which is pretty nice. So let's actually do that. So I'm going to come back into my navigation, and inside of my documentation thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, all right, tree subnav, and I can sort of set that to true. And then I could say tree subnav items, and then set this to an array. And then inside of my array, I could set a URL and a label. So I'm just going to call this subnav item for right now. I'm going to do that 5 times. It gets pretty funky, like whenever you're basically designing with like dynamic data. It's like, okay, like, so I need to create an array. I need to sort of move here and do all of this. But what you're doing is you're creating this component to be fully dynamic, right? So you can now you now have the switch where you can sort of say, okay, sometimes a tree nav item has a subnav. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's set to this. Sometimes you get, style modifier on this other thing to style it differently. And this becomes a conversation, right? Again, with the designer. So by default, what just happened there, you could see we have this whole sort of subnav item sort of thing. These things are showing up in very sort of like dark gray text. Probably wouldn't cut the mustard when it comes to accessibility. I'm just going to sort of come back to Dan's original sort of sketch of an idea for this and just sort of remind myself of like what he sort of had in mind. So, okay, so for this sort of subnav thing here, I actually want to sort of have this sort of left border here, and I want to sort of indent my subnav items. So that's what I'm going to do next, right after I take the dog out. Okay, the dog is out. Time to style some subnav stuff. Cool. All right. Upon looking at this, I'm probably going to have to make this header bigger, wider, just because, again, like this is all going to get scrunched in here, but let's just do this stuff anyways, and then sort of come back to it a little later. So maybe I'll just sort of like float this off to the side just for reference here. Now I want to open my tree nav style sheet. This isn't done very well. So again, I have my like tree nav. And then what I'll tend to do is like sort of just like set up a comment that just sort of defines what a tree nav is. Tree nav is a nested, accordion style navigation, similar to operating system file manager navigations. And that just sort of, I like doing that stuff. It's just like, it's just like, I think a helpful sort of like level setting is like, wait, what is a tree nav? And this becomes especially important whenever you end up with like 75 or 150 components in your design system. And you're like, wait, what is a split block versus what is a stacked block? And it's like, just like having little sort of descriptors of that stuff, I think can be really helpful. So, okay. What I want to do now is create a subnav thing. So I'm going to say, all right, subnav, tree link. Wait, I want to change that to subnav. And what do I want to do here? I want to give it a border left of something, like a color gray. I don't know, it looks pretty faint, and it's on a dark gray background, so let's try that. I'm going to want to do a padding right of like 2 rems or something like that, maybe. I'm going to want to do, oh wait, no, I don't want to do, that's padding left. Padding left of 2 rems, and that will sort of push those subnav items off of the thing. That's maybe too much. Let's just say 1.5 for right now. Yep. Be closer to Dan's thing. Another thing that I'm sort of like looking at is it's like, oh, okay, what is the, you can see this sort of like it's flush up against here. The documentation and the subnav thing are like right up against each other, when in fact there's sort of some space in here. So I might want to say it's not my nav items that I want to have a margin bottom on. I actually might want to sort of set this to display block and then add a margin bottom on there. Would that do the trick? Sort of. Yep. Ish. Maybe. And then maybe I want to sort of like cinch this up a little bit. All right. Maybe that's the way, and maybe I do a margin bottom. Again, like I want to sort of like keep margin bottom like going throughout. I don't want to start sort of mixing and matching sort of things together. So okay, this is starting to feel better. Tree nav link. And what I could do here is see tree nav subnav link. This is where things get funky. So this is one sort of thing that I've only recently started doing. So you can see like how I have, I'm sort of setting my links, my top level links to a certain color. I'm setting my subnav links to that same color. And hypothetically, any other text that I would have in my header, I would want to have that color. And so one thing that I only recently started doing was including sort of a color, and I don't want to do color white. I want to do color gray 50. So now I've sort of defined in my header uh, this color, and now what I should be able to do here is come into my tree nav, and rather than sort of update my link and my sublink and sort of like hard code all of those things, I could set this to inherit. And what should happen, fingers crossed if I'm playing my cards right, is these things will inherit the properties of whatever I set in the header. And so this is nice because what this allows me to do is to control this all from one place. So if I wanted to set this to pink, hopefully, yeah, those will change to pink. That's actually pretty cool. So there's some good articles on color inherit, but that's like it's something that I haven't used all that often, and it's like an instance where like the cascade can be your friend actually. So anyway, so that's helpful, right? And again, like not just these sort of subnav items, but really like any other text, just like even like plain text, I would want to sort of have be that same color unless, unless I'm designing something totally different. Whew. Okay. All right. So let's just see where we're at. And then I might wrap up here a little bit. Subnav item. Okay. Oh, wait. What was it? Margin bottom. I think that I want my display block. Yeah. Okay. So now let me take a look at this thing. This is starting to feel like what Dan's come up with, right? So it's like, okay, I have this sort of navigation that is all sort of equally spaced. I have my sub navigation with this sort of like left-hand border. And again, I can like have a play with that color and sort of stuff like that. We also talked about this brand green and stuff like that. It's like, I don't know, maybe you want to sort of do something funky like that and introduce some color in there. Maybe that's overkill, maybe that's too much, or maybe you want to sort of keep it that sort of subtle thing. But now I feel like I have enough of a page sort of scaffolded out with some basic hooks in there that gives me enough to have another conversation with Dan. Oh, maybe the last thing I'll do is sort of sort out what to do with this whole sort of like fixed versus not fixed sort of thing. So I guess what I would want to do, let's think, header. Oh wait, no, there was another thing I wanted to do, which was to sort of beef up this sidebar width a little bit too, because I didn't like the idea. Yeah, so we have our sort of grid template columns set to 250 pixels. And I think what we want to do is maybe I'll change that to 320. That buys me a little bit more space for some of these things. And let me just I'll pick one of the longer ones from the actual documentation, from the actual like live site. Come back in here. This is where it really helps to sort of be able to sort of override a bit of data. Just get a more accurate representation of what's going on here. So I want to make sure that, right, this nav works really well, even if, it's short titles, long titles, everything in between. Refreshing that. again, all of that stuff, that stuff is crazy helpful for having thoughtful conversations with the designer. One of my biggest pet peeves of working with designers in the past was like they would just design the best case scenario all the time, where there's just like all of the text. There were never any orphans, there were never any sort of unfilled profile blocks, or there, all of the text just sort of neatly fit together. And it's like they're, sort of, they're cheating, right? They're creating this best case scenario, and they're like, oh, look, like here's this great, sort of design situation, when in fact, the reality of the content in the product needs to be something wildly different. So this is where I think like having this ability to sort of manipulate things very quickly in JSON and sort of see that reflected on the front end allows us to sort of have better conversations. So just as a great example of this is like, okay, modifying the pattern header and footer. That is wrapping onto 2 lines. There's an orphan there. So the question becomes, okay, what do we do about that? Do we say, let's see here. Do I go, we want to increase that sort of, the actual sort of width of the sidebar? Let's just move it to 360 and see what happens there. But then is that too wide, right? Is that sort of like too chunky? Probably, I think. That's my gut on that, but I would welcome Dan's thoughts on that as well. So it's like, okay, or then like, what can we do to sort of maybe, we can rewrite the copy. Maybe we can sort of remove the word pattern and it just says modifying the header and footer. Maybe that works. Maybe we change that ampersand to an and then that will wrap it onto 2 lines or something. Or maybe we cap that width at a certain width so that, it sort of is forced to another line. So it's not an orphan. All of those are like viable options. And again, it's like, this is, I think, one of the best things about sort of getting into the environment, the actual environment that the site will live in, to sort of be confronted by that stuff, be confronted by these realities of your content, of the browser, of different quirks and sort of outcomes sooner rather than later. And that, I think, leads to sort of more robust, resilient, and sort of flexible products at the end of the day. So I think with that said, I think I'm going to wrap up here just because I feel like I've accomplished enough wherever I can sort of circle back with Dan. So again, this was, I don't know however long, but I did a little bit of work, a lot of bit of talking. And so just, again, to just really reemphasize this point, it's like, you could put your head down for an hour and a half or 2 hours, and then very quickly emerge and say like, hey, designer, like I have some stuff, like I sort of like rough some stuff out. Do you have a minute to sort of talk through some of this stuff? And in that sort of same amount of time, that designer can also be head down in their own world, sort of exploring some ideas and doing some stuff. But the idea is just sort of like, go away, quickly do some stuff, make some progress, like have your own sort of like think time and time to sort of play, but then very quickly sort of like come back together to sort of like see how the developer sort of reacted to the designs and how the development environment can sort of help influence the designer's sort of future workflow. So again, it's collaboration. It's not all we have to do this live together in the room all the time, 24 hours a day. But it is like, being very explicit and sort of thoughtful with like your alone time. You're not doing this to sort of like to boost your ego or to sort of do things the right way, and like, oh, I'm so afraid of showing my sort of work to my teammates because it's not done. It's like we have to sort of like get over that stuff. It's like these are your partners in this, right? You're all working on building the same thing. And I know that if Dan were doing an hour and a half of work as well, I wouldn't fully expect it to be, fully done and fleshed out or whatever, the same way that I'm sure that he doesn't expect that I've finished the whole website in the same amount of time. So it's about that sort of trust. It's about that, like, oh, hey, we're making progress. We're like getting more things done. We're like sort of some of these things are sort of being sort of coagulating. Some of these ideas are, some of these things aren't, and we can sort of discard those and react to those things and sort of get good work done. But yeah, all of that is in pursuit of launching a website that it might start looking like this. So I'm personally pleased with how this came out, and I'm excited to talk to Dan to see where we could take it. So, thank you so much for joining me on this journey, and hopefully that was helpful for you, and hopefully this thing uh, hopefully this thing works. Hopefully I haven't just been talking to myself for the last hour and a half. But anyways, I'd love to, any feedback anybody might have, and yeah, if you want me to do more of these, I'm happy to do that as well. So, okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.